Bronze Age fools and copper lights, chamber pots and Templar knights. Study, read, then be burnt in effigy, 'cause we make fun of archaeology. And we also do dinosaurs. Yes, we also
Welcome
do
to another episode
dinosaurs.
of Goblinological Fantasies.
Back to
I'm your host, the Mayor of Goblin
Rome.
Town, and I have as a guest on the the amazing Dr. Katerina Minniti, an archaeologist specializing in archaic Sicily and the archaic Mediterranean. She's an Archaeo-gamer and the leading expert on monsters in Egyptian video games. Everyone, welcome. Give her applause. Yay! All right, Dr. Kate.
Yes, hi. Thank you for having me.
All right, it's a pleasure and an honor to have you on. Okay, um, so you had your, I'm sure your dissertation was incredibly fun and enjoyable. So we're gonna do it a second time.
Yay, I can't wait. Oh, God.
uh, your expertise, as I mentioned before, is archaic Sicily,
Mhm,
and specifically about archaic Sicily, you were specializing in specific set of objects that you called Aegyptica, or you specifically want to refer to as Aegyptica. There's a few other terms, and you can explain why
mhm.
your choice. I guess first I'd like you to explain the time period that you're studying about Sicily, like what makes it that time period, and just
Mhm.
give us some of the background on your field.
Yeah, so the archaic period is a convention. It's not real. Like people did not wake up the day before and said, "I'm going to be archaic tomorrow," and then wake up the day after like, "Oh, I feel so archaic today." Conventionally, it's the time period between the first Olympics, which is 776 BCE, and the two important battles in the Mediterranean, on two sides of the Mediterranean, actually, both fought in 480 BCE. One is the Battle of Salamis during the Second Persian War, fought in Greece between not all, but several Greek polis, and especially Athens, and the Persians. And the other one is the Battle of Himera, which is fought, you guessed it, in Himera, in Sicily, between an alliance of some of the Greek polis of Sicily and an alliance between some other Greek polis and the Carthaginians that had come to invade Sicily. So 480 BCE is usually the end of the archaic period, but it's a convention, right? But it kind of makes sense because political power shifts after that, and the international balance of power also moves. So yeah, that is generally the time period that I in which I specialize. And I chose that because it is very interesting for Sicily. I don't want to say that it's understudied, but it's not studied in the ways in which I like to study things, which is the social aspect of material culture. There's a lot of architectural studies because it's when the big temples are built, right? These giant, fantastic temples, they are built in the archaic period. So a lot of that. There's a lot of study on how the Greeks and the Phoenicians arrived and set up camp and set up cities. Not a lot of social studies in archaeology, which is what I'm trying to do with my work.
Yeah, that sounds fantastic. Some of the things I want to point out that you said is, so
Mhm,
you were talking about different polises. You
mhm,
specifically used the word international,
mhm.
and you had the alliance. You mentioned the alliance with Phoenician polises.
Yeah, Carthage. Well, yes, they're Carthaginians because they're coming from Carthage, but the Phoenicians are also in the Persian army in Greece. So yeah, the Phoenicians are in the mix.
Oh, okay, and I think that that specific point, right, the mix, is what's
Hmm.
going to be important for our topic today,
Hmm.
because we are talking about the context of the Mediterranean as a whole and the internet. International trade right across from different parts of the Mediterranean,
Hmm.
centered at least in this case Sicily. That you mentioned that archaic in this context is from 776 to 480 BC, um, but like in everything else it says like Iron Age and things like that, and so I'm kind of
Hmm.
confused sometimes. Okay, like we're talking about Greece or China or India, and like what's exactly the absolute time scale that we're using?
Well, I mean, in this case, I'm still in kind of quote unquote the Greek world or the Mediterranean world. So if you say archaic period, you have the dates, and you have the specific dates, but these are Greek dates, right?
Oh,
So
okay.
we are using Greek dates to apply to everything. If you want to be a bit more large in scope, you can say Iron Age that starts before 776. But there's not like 1 year in which the Iron Age quote unquote begins, right? There's like a century more or less.
Well, yeah, just for the audience, then it's right that when we talk about uh Bronze Age, Iron Age. That's more of a cultural construction, being like, this is a set of cultural technology and like practices that come out, and we're just gonna label this kind of grouping as Iron Age, right?
Yeah. Yeah, yeah. And I think that like traditionally the Iron Age is like 1200 to maybe 600 BCE for Mediterranean studies, but that's not really the time period in which I'm interested, because I was interested in the time period in which the Greeks arrive in Sicily, and they arrive in the Archaic period in the 8th century. Like the first colony is like 740 something BCE in Sicily. I should know this, sorry. So it's like it's just smack in the middle, and then it ends with the Battle of Himera, which actually changes a lot of things for Sicily. So it worked for my work, but I do think that we should start expanding these definitions and making them less Greek centric.
Oh, okay. Okay, make them more Egyptian centric.
I mean, don't tell Egyptians that. Because they would do that.
Okay, okay, all right. Now let's get a little bit more specific here, because
Mhm,
Aegyptica.
mhm.
So what is Aegyptica?
Okay, so Aegyptica is a very, very flawed umbrella term for a very, very varied group of objects. I've subdivided. So first of all, no two scholars agree on what should be included in this group of objects, right? Um, but like the main categories, let's put it this way, are scarabs, unguent vessels, so like small vessels, like for ointments, oil, and other things, amulets, statuettes, but like the little ones. Ushabtis, which are funerary statuettes. They're very specific. Some people add like beads to these. Some people don't like to consider the ushabtis in the mix. I limited it to like 5 categories of things, and they're small, they're portable. I chose to define them as like objects whose origin or like prototype was clearly Egyptian, even though, as we will see, like most of the objects were actually not made in Egypt, but their prototype is clearly Egyptian. Um, but a lot of people don't like the definition. They don't like the name. A lot of people tend to include some very Phoenician objects too, like glass, little glass bottles that are, once again, same function as the unguentaria, but the origin is still Phoenician. So I didn't really feel comfortable including them. It's a mess, right? People have beef with one another for how to call them, and I don't like the name because it's a Greek name, right?
Yeah.
But there's no way to like. There is something to be said about like a convenient but not particularly good term to indicate a whole class of objects. Otherwise, I would have to write, five lines every time I want to. And I'm Italian; I don't need to write more than I already do.
Well, I think this is always the issue for everybody when they're making categories: is are you a
Mm,
lumber or are you a splitter? I mean, that's just it.
right,
That's how it
right.
is.
And it's like, how do you cut the cake,
Yeah.
right?
Okay. Now, uh, so to bridge those two things, right? So we have some, you said, scarabs,
Mhm,
amulets, ushapti, that's associated with Egyptian culture,
mhm.
but we're talking about Sicily, right?
Yes.
So this is what your work is about: is that you're finding these objects in Sicily.
Yes. So, well, actually, this started from the excavation in which I am currently working in Selinunte. It's the NYU and University of Milan excavation. Selinunte is a weird Greek city because it's the westernmost of Greek foundations, but it's very, how can we say? They were really buddies with the Phoenicians, maybe too much, and then they regretted that a lot. But I digress. And we're actually digging in like an archaic temple, one of the earliest Greek temples, stone Greek temples in Sicily. And when we dug the foundation deposit of the temple in 2012, what we found was a faience amulet of an Apis bull, and that's Egyptian. Like, there's no way around that. That's an Egyptian amulet. And I was very intrigued, and I was like, well, I wonder if there are others of this kind of like other Egyptian things in Sicily. I should premise with the fact that I am a recovering Egyptologist. I have a degree in Egyptian archaeology. I don't practice anymore. I'm not part of the club anymore, but still, like, I practice it in other ways. But this sounded like the perfect opportunity to put together, my classics and classical archaeology degree and my Egyptian archaeology degree. And I went around and looked in various museums. Like, I could roam around Sicily because we had cars, and lo and behold, there are many, like many, many, many objects. They're like For my thesis, I think we're around the 400, like I think we're past the 400 mark. And so I was curious about them, and I was like wondering if anyone had done any studies on them. The last time someone cataloged all of them was 1973 at the
Wow.
time. Yeah. There was an attempt in 2013, but it wasn't a really good one, and it was only in Italian. It wasn't really a study, it was more like a catalog, but things were missed. And then literally the year before I defended my dissertation, another big study came out, but it was once again more of a catalog made by like a big name in Egyptology, Professor Günther Holble, who is a lovely person, a lovely man, and we actually corresponded with a new and updated, catalog of all of this stuff. And yet, still not all of them, so, because there are many. But at that point, and his approach is different from mine. So I was asking myself, why are these things here and how are they used? But before I could ask all of that, I had to actually track them all down because Holble's publication was not out yet. So I had to scour every publication I could, every site report I could, every museum to find the objects. And then when I found them like physically in the museums, I need to ask for permission to access, the records and everything else. If I couldn't find them in museums, which happens more often than you think, I just had the publications to go on. It was a massive, massive endeavor. And thank goodness I was able to go to Sicily to actually see the objects in person. I got like a fellowship to do that. So thank you, UBC. And so I managed to find out that around 260, 270 something actually have context information, which is what I could use in my dissertation. And the others don't have contextual information at all. So I cannot use that. So I had to do this massive archival work first, and then I could start asking myself the questions by looking at the things in context. And by looking at the things in context, I started, crunching the numbers and looking at trends and everything else. And I divided, once again, maybe I'm a splitter because I divided the thing in three massive like macro chronological periods. So 8th century and like to the middle of the 7th, then to the beginning of the 7th, then 7th to beginning of 6th, and then 6th to beginning of 5th. It made sense because it was very regular, but it actually works because those correspond to big social and political changes in Sicily, and you can see that the use of these objects changes. So at the very beginning, you find these objects in the tombs of very rich elite people. They are not Greek and they're not Phoenicians. They are one of the 3, let's say, macro groups that are already that are indigenous to Sicily, the Sicels, and they have them with imported Greek vases and weapons. Then in the 7th century is when the international, smacks you in the face, because these objects start appearing everywhere, not only in Sicily, I have to say, in the Mediterranean, and they become part of how the international elite community represents itself and interacts with one another. They become a signifier of, status and prestige, which is the currency of the century. And then in the 6th century is when the mass production of these objects starts. And as for many things that are first only for the elites and then they become more mainstream, I don't want to say less good, but like, products of like inferior quality, let's put it this way, start being mass produced, and they were probably cheaper, and they start appearing in tombs and contexts that are really not elite. But at the same time, the elite keeps getting the good stuff, right? But they become way more widespread than in the 7th and 8th century put together. So the 6th century is actually the boom of these. And I decided to end with like the beginning of the 5th century BCE, because then Sicily becomes completely something else. So I thought it was a nice place to stop, right? Also, I had to stop somewhere.
Yeah, I think that is the other sort of issue for these sorts of projects, is where do you start and where do you stop, right? Because
Exactly.
you have to be, the beginning is how much context do you need to introduce your subject, and then when do you have to stop,
Mm-hmm.
because these effects will continue on through for much longer than you might expect. Okay, so let me sort of summarize for our
Please.
audience here. Okay.
Sorry, I went long.
That shows passion. So we're talking about Sicily.
Mm-hmm.
Um, one of the things that I think is interesting is like Sicily had an indigenous population, and what was the name of the Sickles? The
Sicels, yeah, Sikels. Yeah, they're not the only ones. There are also the Sicanians who also use them, and the Hellenians who also use these objects. But also, It's very debatable whether these three people were different, how they're different, how they call themselves. It's a whole mess. But, for simplicity's sake, yes, indigenous people.
Yeah, so we have this indigenous population of Sicily. Then we have I don't know remember the chronology, but we have Greeks and Phoenicians also come onto the island,
Mhm,
and they set up their own colonies there, set up their own cities, and then you have this sort of mix. And the Greeks and Phoenicians are then importing these objects, the Aegyptica that we were talking about, which would be the scarabs, the amulets, the ushabti, the
mhm,
beads, and then these are then consumed in a sort of I guess a commercial context, by
mhm.
beginning with the elites, and eventually as time goes on, they are produced more and more, and it trickles down to the rest of the population. Is that fine?
Yes. Yes, yes. It's not trickle down economy, but yes. That never works.
What I want then now is the second moment to sort of think about, because sort of going over some of your other interviews and some of your work, and in look, okay, so I did a little bit of research, read a little bit of the Archaeology of the Mediterranean Iron Age, a Globalizing World, CE 1100 600 BCE by Tamar Hodos.
Mhm.
And what I think is really interesting is kind of the parallels between this particular situation and us today. So I want you to try to give us what are some analogous examples of today's consumption that would kind of match what we see here in Sicily.
Okay, the one that I used for my defense, and where Tamar Hodos was there because she was my external reader, and she's an absolute firecracker, and I love her to pieces. The example I used was French bulldogs.
Oh.
And I did that not to be controversial, but because one of the professors who was also in my dissertation committee has a French bulldog, so I was like, playing on that. He knows I love that dog, but they're poorly made. It's not their fault. So at the beginning, I swear I have a point. I'm not hating on the dogs. I mean, I'm not hating on the dogs themselves. I'm hating on the breeders. So at the beginning, French bulldogs were only for the few, right?
Yes.
They were a very elite dog. They had a snout. They were taller, and they had, they were still kind of dogs. You can apply this to pugs too if you want, like if any brachycephalic dog. And then as time goes on, their price starts reducing because there's more demand. Certain breeders start making them, how can we say, with a less care for detail, which is terrible in terms of animal breeding, right? And now way more people can afford French bulldogs, but not everyone can afford a French bulldog who is able to breathe and function as a normal dog. So the quality has gone down as the demand has gone up. You can use, Rolex watches. You can use anything that you like, but it's always the same thing, right? The elite starts using something, and then other people see them as status symbol, and they also want in. But once you start having something and you're not part of the elite, then that thing is not a status symbol anymore, right? And the quality is also going to decrease because there's coin to be made, so someone is going to open a mass production factory. That's the general idea.
Yeah. Keeping with the dog example, I would like the listeners to go look up the skull of a pug. They
Oh,
no longer have eye sockets. It's just a
yeah.
round skull and then cheekbones, and their eyeballs basically rest on their cheekbones. It's bizarre.
And it's not, it's not their fault. And actually, dogs are being bred with like the other dogs that have like a snout now, so they're making retropugs to give them back a snout. But like, couldn't we just leave them be as they were before we made the mess, and I would try to undo it? I mean, anyways, yeah, please adopt and don't shop. Anyways.
Another example I think would be the AirPods. So Apple's AirPods.
Mhm.
I don't remember the prices they were, but the current price now would be like $160 to $200, something like that. But I know I can get a similar product for like $20 or $30 now, which is the
Yep.
product I currently own because I'm not one of the rich people, not part of the elite.
You're a 6th century person, but then again, I wouldn't know. I'm an Android person, so.
Yeah. Well, no, I don't use Apple products either. But there's just a sort of generic kind of AirPod that you can connect to anything. Anyways, I wrote
Mhm,
in my notes here knockoffs. Do you think
mhm.
knockoff would actually be an appropriate term in this case, or the people just didn't care?
I don't think so. Okay, no. Let me rephrase that. I'll try to not be too long. We don't know. Like, I don't think that a lot of people cared about it because it's not. For a lot of people, it's clear that it's not the object itself, but what it can do, right, for scarabs, for instance, do you even care if the hieroglyphs are real? Do you even care if it comes from Egypt, or do you just care about having a little amulet to give to your wife and children because it's a protective amulet? Like, I don't think, I don't want to say that people were way more practical back then. I'm sure someone cared, because otherwise, why would people in the 6th century still try to import the really really cool stuff as opposed to the cheap knockoffs? But I don't think that everyone cared the same way. Like, I think it's a spectrum. You go from, oh no, I only want the fancy rings with the fancy things that I can bring that are actually from Egypt and certified, to, I don't care what this is, does it work? Yes, I'll get it for my child. Right, it's a spectrum.
Yeah, I I, so I'm probably going to end up giving a lot of examples that come from the East Asian context, but
Mhm.
this is probably similar to like Chinese characters, where people put that
Mm.
character on things and like, okay, this is now signifies that it's Asian, that it's exotic, and half the
Mhm.
time the symbols don't make sense or they're written kind of weird or whatever. Actually, I think I have a sword on my wall that does that.
Right. That's an example that has come up in like in discussion, and there was, I like, in some chapters written about this kind of stuff, and like the Egyptomania, it has also come out several times, right? The whole issue with like how do you call it, chinoiserie, which is like everything that is Chinese but like quote unquote Chinese, and it's also like a wave of fashion things in the 1800s and 1900s. So it is similar, but I don't know how much, like, when that's not a problem. That's also why I chose to call them Aegyptia, kind of like Egyptian and Egyptianizing, because what is Egyptianizing? Like, why do we care about the actual origin of the objects when people back then probably did not, right?
Yeah.
So it's a very modern problem to have, I think. But I would love to read more about the whole concept of it's a copy, it's a knockoff in antiquity, if we ever had anything to prove any of this, by the way.
I'm thinking of the one copper guy. What is it, Esar or whatever? I'm trying to.
Oh yeah, Nazir. Oh well, but he was a scammer. He was a scammer, a swindler.
Well, what I'm hoping, what I'm praying for, is that we'll eventually find some like cachet of like letters saying, "How dare you send me this knockoff? I only want authentic Egyptian artifacts," or
Oh,
something.
we would be so lucky. Oh my god, I would love this. I would love this. But fun fact, we know that some of this stuff was stolen from tombs. So from earlier Egyptian tombs and sold or brought to Sicily and used in tombs. But these people didn't know how to, like, that's the thing with Ushabti. You need your name on Ushabti for it to work. It's a magic item, right? It needs to have your name to work in your afterlife for you. If you have someone else's name, it's not gonna work. But these people didn't know and probably didn't care. They just got these Ushabtis and swords from Theban tombs in Sicily, and they just put them in their own tombs. So clearly they care about the origin but not the authenticity of the experience. Otherwise, they would have had their own name recarved.
A thought just occurred to me.
Hmm.
So many of the tombs of royalty in Egypt were discovered looted already.
Yes.
I'm wondering if we would eventually find all of those treasures scattered across the Mediterranean.
I mean, I'm not gonna say yes, surely, but yes. A lot of times, yes. It was this is a big tangent, but like we know that it was the clergy of Amun itself scouring the Theban necropolis for gold and silver and everything else. Because there was, like, in the third intermediate period and the late period, there was like a big economic crisis. So they had to steal other people's coffins because there was no wood. They had to open the tombs of the kings to save the mummies, but also to take all the gold and silver that was in there. Like, you're not far off. Like, you're really not far off the mark in there.
Oh.
As I said, recovering, but still an Egyptologist.
um, okay, there's two questions I have in my notes. I don't know if we'll be able to cover these exactly. Um,
Okay,
so, uh, so two of the things I was thinking of is, well, let's do the more difficult one first, and then the other one will be the easier one, I think, because
hit me.
yeah. So, um, like my first sort of impression, sort of looking at your or listening to your interviews, I'm like, this sounds like
Mhm.
cultural appropriation. But
Aha.
yeah, but I was reading Hodos's book, and
Mhm.
she dedicates quite a bit of time to the difference between colonization and colonialism, right? Which would be basically, a parallel term, parallel idea.
Mhm.
And so I'm just thinking, like, how is this situation different? Why would that not be the appropriate way to think of this, or is it?
Okay. I kind of knew that this question would come, so I prepared myself. Actually, I'm ready for that. So give me an example of cultural appropriation. Let's do it the other way around. Like when I tell you cultural appropriation, what do you think about?
Well, I guess the kind of the more like infamous ones would be things like blackface.
Oh, I was thinking about Coachella, but yes, that also works. Right? I was thinking about like white girls wearing like a war bonnet at Coachella, right? As a statement,
Okay.
right? As a fashion statement,
Okay.
right? But here's the thing: in antiquity, like so for it to be cultural appropriation, you need to have a culture or a cultural group that has been historically oppressed, whose stuff that has like symbolic meaning gets taken by the oppressing culture and then like devoided completely of all its meanings and sold as like fashion, right?
Okay.
That's how cultural appropriation works. That's not it in antiquity. That's not it. Like nobody is oppressing Egyptians. I mean, if you listen to Egyptians, everyone's oppressing them all the time, but nobody's oppressing, right? Nobody is oppressing Egyptians, and nobody is taking their stuff that they hold sacred, discriminating them for using it, and then appropriating it to use it as a fashion thing. Like that's not how it works, and that's really not how antiquity works. Now, I'm sure imperial powers in antiquity did that. Like if I had to guess, I would say that the Egyptians may have been doing that with Nubia because the Egyptians were colonizing, like violently colonizing, like with a very imperialistic strike, the kingdom of Kush, right? So they could have done that. But the Greeks to the Egyptians, no. With this thing, no. Also because nobody's stopping Egyptians from using their stuff. If anything, the Greeks felt inferior to Egypt, right? They had this great appreciation for Egypt. They had a kind of orientalistic view of Egypt in which Egyptians were really good at everything. They were good at maths. They were not. They were good at astronomy. They were great magicians. They were great doctors. Debatable, but okay. They were very ancient, which is true, and they had invented everything. So actually, if anything, they were like showing their appreciation for Egypt by by like using their stuff, and probably most of the value, the magic value, right, that some of these amulets had was because they came from Egypt, the land of magic, right? So I think it's the other way around. That this is not cultural appropriation. This is more like, I don't know, young Italians try to replicate like US TV shows to be cool.
Okay, so I think in the modern context that that might be some like an Italian wearing a tracksuit or something like that.
Something of the sort,
Yeah.
yeah. I mean, or like Italians in the 1950s wearing the leather jacket to look like Arthur Fonzarelli.
Hey! Um,
Exactly.
the okay, so actually, I think probably the more analogous
Mhm.
term would probably be like a cargo cult, right? Because it's
Ooh,
right because
ooh.
Egypt is thought of as the smarter one, the richer one, the more technologically advanced, and then
Hmm.
Greeks are sort of imitating that. And in the case of Sicily, right, like you said, Ushabtis, they have the thing, but they don't know how it works. They just have the thing
Yeah.
because it signifies something powerful to them. And
Yes.
so,
Yes.
at least when we're sort of thinking cargo cults, again, kind of a confusing and sort of maybe controversial term, but right, it's
Hmm.
the idea is that this particular group doesn't know how the plane works, doesn't know how to bring
Hmm.
it in, and so they make a sort of some sort of gesture to imitate what they saw, right? And I think that's
Hmm.
probably more parallel.
Yes. No, I would say it is. And there's also like the thing that it's not just the Greeks that are using this stuff, right? It's also like the Phoenicians that knew the Egyptians really well, and they were at war with them for on the regular, but they've also been using this stuff for much longer. And also indigenous people who didn't know Egypt at all. So, right? I mean, I would love to go back and see how the first traders were selling this stuff to the Seco like chiefs. Oh my god, I would pay gold to see that. Like what pitch were they making for this stuff? Like were they making a pitch for this stuff at all? Or was it just that it was on big gold and silver rings? And then they're like, and look, apart from like the value that it has, there's also this thing from a faraway land. Who knows?
Okay, wait. Well, one of the most common objects we found were scarabs, right?
Hmm.
Are scarabs endemic to Sicily? Did they even know what a scarab was?
They have beetles, yes. Oh, they have chunky ones.
So I could imagine they're like, here's this ancient Egyptian scarab, and they're like, it looks like a cockroach.
Yeah, it's like, oh,
$100.
it's our bug. Yeah. Oh, wow, it looks like just the one that we have. I was like, yeah, but this one's magic. But we don't know. That's the whole thing, right? We don't know if the ancient indigenous people of Sicily or the Greeks had any theologic ideas about bugs, right? We're not told. Maybe they did. Maybe they started, it was like, oh, it kind of looks like our god. And it's like, and they were like, yes, and this one actually rolls, the ball of the sun in the sky every morning. If the traders even knew that, because we're doing, we're leaping to big assumptions here. I don't know how much these people knew about the stuff they were buying. Some people must have known, but this is also a big discussion for like the Archaic period for Greek vases. Like when sometimes you find Greek vases with like myths, like Attic vases with Greek myths, in tombs in Etruria. And a lot of people have, jumped to conclusions saying, oh, clearly these people knew the myths and they wanted to see themselves represented on the vases. Like, did they though? Did they all? Like, really? Like, aren't we just making a lot of assumptions? So I don't know. There have been scholars who have been beefing for decades about this stuff. Let me tell you.
Okay. Okay. So there was. Okay, so we're gonna shift a little bit over to another
Mhm,
question that I had, which was like consumption. Okay, so moving more into this will segue basically into the world building aspect that I'm gonna use this for. It's that when we think of cultures, we're thinking like this is a
mm,
culture in their context, this is their land, this is how they see
mhm,
things, and then they make this material culture out of it, and then they basically are like this factory just pumping it out. But in
mhm.
this case, in what we're talking about here, is that it's Sicily or somewhere else is producing these things, and then Sicily's consuming it, and then
Mhm.
that's how we're sort of describing the culture of Sicily, is that it's how it's consuming these objects.
Saying culture of Sicily is also a big generalization because there's no culture of, right? There's even Greek culture. Like when we say, oh, Greek culture for the Archaic period, girl, no. They don't call each other Greeks and they don't consider themselves like similar to their neighbors until much later, right? There's no Greece until much later. So when we talk about cultures, we need to be very careful. Like the biggest division that we can find in the Archaic period is ethnic.
I see.
So all of these polis, for instance, oh, they all have like an Ionic. They are like part of the Ionic ethnic. So Athens and the colonies on the west coast of Anatolia, those are all Ionic, right? The Doric cities, so Sparta and the likes, and their colonies, which we shouldn't call colonies, but that's another beef I have in the West, they all consider each other, related, but they will also go to war with one another with no issues. So there's no we, right? That's another thing that changes after 480 BCE. After 480 BCE, there is a we against others, right? Because these things start to congeal because powers start to become much bigger than just smaller micro, like centralizing cities or like pieces of regions. But this is about, like, when we talk about cultures, we should not think about monoliths, right? Especially in the ancient world, there's no monolithic Greek culture because the stuff that you use in Corinth is not the same stuff that you use in Athens. The gods that you worship in Corinth, yeah, more or less belong to the same pantheon, to the ones that you worship in Athens, but not necessarily. And some of the local gods in Athens are absolutely not worshipped anywhere in Greece, for instance. There is something to be said about I chose Sicily because it's an island and it's self contained, but that's also a can of worms because it's a big can of worms, right? Because you got the people who come there and, like, what is their identity? So the easy answer is their identity is their own city, right? They don't call themselves anything else until later. They call themselves, for instance, the people in Selinunte, they call themselves the Selinuntines, and they're like, yeah, we are the Selinuntines, and that's it. And they hate the next door Greek cities just as much as they hate the next door indigenous cities and the Phoenician ones. They all hate each other. It's beautiful.
Well, okay. So coming back to sort of video games and world building, right? I
Hmm.
think like okay, so reading your reading up on the subject, right? There's part of
Hmm.
me that was very excited and terrified, which is because in video games you have these different towns, and each of the towns are very
Mm,
very distinct, and very separated, like segregated from each other. Right, and
Yes.
so when you're saying that like each of these different cities are like they hate the next city over, that makes me as a world builder for the games, that makes
Mhm.
my job easier, right? But the fact that part of this is wait, and again going over like
Mhm.
Hodos's book, right? It's
Mhm.
that each of these locales would take the kind of base object or whatever, and in the one I was looking at was like ceramic pots,
Mhm.
right? And then do their own
Yes.
spin on it. And so
Yes.
for me as a world builder, I'm like, crap. I can't just make this city that's sort of unique and sort of insular and complete unto itself. I have to also make how it's interacting with the next city over and like
Mhm.
consuming these other objects and how it's
Mhm.
trading. And the thing is, let the audience on a secret, guys. Dungeon masters are flying by the seat of their pants. They're making up stuff as they go. And so the idea, like when I make up a city, then realize, oh crap, I have to make not this city that they're in, but the next 2 or 3 or 4 cities because there's going to be a relationship there. And I'm like,
Right. You need to think of the system,
yeah,
right? You need to think of the systems. Yeah. Well, in terms of world building, it's like I don't know. I mean, in games, it's easier to imagine insular communities, but then when you start thinking about how things works in the real world, is there really like an insular community? That's also like an argument in pseudo archaeology against like, oh, the invasion of these people or the arrival of these people. Where is the stuff?
yeah.
Where do we see that in the material culture, right?
Right.
Like how they, but in games, something that I always found funny is when two well, let's call them cultures, but like with a lot of caveats, use things in a different way. So I was once in a game in which in one civilization, people were dancing like, to dance as like as a fun activity, and the other civilization was actually dancing to communicate. They didn't talk, they just danced. So it's like it's the same thing, but they're using it in two very different ways. And I mean, it's not that the archaic Mediterranean was like that, but for some things it may have kind of been like that, and for some things absolutely not, because some things like we see that people use them in the same way. But in terms of world building, I sympathize with the pain because it is complex. You need to think about bigger systems, right? There's no insulated, and even if it's insulated, then you're like, oh, but what if my players like, whip up something that these people have never seen? How would they use it?
I okay, we're not there yet, or we're not yet to the section where we plot to
Mhm,
kill players,
mhm.
but this is something. We'll try not to do this right now, but I'm very tempted to introduce an object in one city that's used for one way, and
Oh
then
yeah.
once they get to the city where it's actually from, that's used completely different, and then to watch the players like screw up and try to use it, but that's just too mean.
Oh, well, but that would be a great thing, though. It doesn't need to be something that is painful. Like it could be a chamber pot. Like how do you, or like something? Maybe that's too easy. But we can think about it in the session on how to kill the people.
I guess just one last thing is, and then of course the sort of tension that we're talking about here is that
Mhm,
different areas and different locales are using things differently. But at least for the Aegyptica that we're talking about, that it became a
mhm.
kind of international symbol of status.
Yes, among other things. That's like the fascinating thing. And like I wish I had like 3 more hours to talk about it. So the thing with like ancient globalization or like glocalization, which is the word that I use front and center in my dissertation because buzzwords. Am I right? Am I right, boys?
Globalization.
Um, right. We gotta use all of these. It's that like everyone. So there is a big international community, like international meaning like around the Mediterranean, more or less, in which people of equal status or wannabe people of wannabe equal status are communicating not just with their own communities, but with their wannabe peers across the sea, um, with a set of objects, right? Once again, there's not a lot of consensus about the set. Some people say, oh no, it's just, it's these things, and some people say this other, but like generally speaking, you got ivory stuff, you got the Aegyptica, you got the fine Greek pottery, you got jewels, you got metal bowls that are very fancily decorated. It's the fancy stuff, right? You have it, you are in. But here's the thing, this can also mean that societies are still kind of fluid because there's a buy-in for the elite, right? Because if it's a very exclusionary elite, then you cannot buy your way in, no matter the stuff that you buy and no matter how you use it. But if you can buy it in, not only by owning the right stuff, but displaying it, right? There's the performativity of it, the theatricality. You need to display it in the right place at the right time to the right people, you know, to prove that you are part of this community. And we see this in sanctuaries, because sanctuaries, oh, they become like, well, Coachella, but, ancient, because you can make these beautiful donations, and probably also like in like inside the cities themselves, donations to local temples and sanctuaries might have been an occasion to show off this stuff. Public banquets, funerals, right? Oh my god, like, yeah, if there is a funerary ritual, you are going to show off with the blings because you need to show off. So there's like some sort of, probably there's some sort of social fluidity, but there's also like this opening up to more people. And the thing then comes around, because prestige is something that you can only acquire if you open up, right? Because at this point you want international prestige, and international prestige is only given by being international, but it also needs to be something that is recognized by your own culture. Otherwise it's not going to work, because you're not speaking the same language, right? So there needs to be at least some overlap in the language of material culture between what you're showing off to your peers internationally and what you're showing off to your people at home, which is also why these objects are not alone, but they work with the local symbols of prestige and power. Owning one scarab is not enough, but if you start owning also, the Greek pots, but also the local symbols of power, like the weapons, the jewels, maybe some sacrifices, then you are in. I don't know if that explains it, but like, you need to speak more or less the same language to obtain prestige. Otherwise, one part is not going to recognize you.
Yeah, I think, I guess to try to summarize it is that if you're creating this group of elite, right, you have to have some sort of performative action to show that you're
Hmm.
part of the group. But the thing is, though,
Hmm.
you have to allow people to fall out of the group or fall into the group as long as they can kind
Hmm.
of maintain their money, their prestige, their power, right?
Hmm.
And so there has to be a little bit of flexibility then, at least in terms of the materials, like the status symbols.
Yes, and also like there needs to be like a local community that says, okay, you have these things, you are the elite of the local community. Otherwise, it doesn't work.
A lot of the things so one of the objects that we were talking about were vessels, right?
Mm.
And so
Yes.
some of the thing so some of the value of that vessel was not the vessel necessarily itself, but what was in it. um
Hmm.
so my thought was like, okay, so the vessel itself is considered Egyptian, quote unquote, and then what about the stuff in it? Was it also considered Egyptian, or?
That is a great question. I wish we knew. Um, so, well, first of all, let me clarify that these are like small vessels. So it's not like you're bringing oil, like olive oil or wine. You're bringing perfume, probably,
Okay.
or some sort of like, or maybe makeup. Like, it's possible that you could have makeup in some of these. I don't know if the content would have been considered, Egyptian or anything else. I am sure that some tricky trader was pitching it as authentic perfume from the East. Like, I'm ready to bet. Right, I'm telling you, right? But because, and we also know that like Greeks had a very complicated relationship with perfumes and ointments and everything else. There are a lot of books written on the erotic power of perfume and how the Greeks were absolutely obsessed with it, and they had weird ideas about panthers. Actually luring their prey with like by emitting perfume. I'm not joking, it's fantastic. It's weird, but but no panthers on Aegyptica, so we don't need to talk about that.
Are you telling me that the Greeks were into cougars?
I mean, aren't we all? Can we blame them? But we don't know, because we don't have writing, like we don't have anything written about this stuff, and we a lot of times, most of the times, we don't have the contents of these objects. So the question then becomes like, if you're acquiring these, like you're acquiring it for the vessel or for the content, and if you're dedicating it, are you dedicating it for the vessel or for the content, or both?
Yeah, so the idea that struck me before this interview
Hmm.
was taking all these sort of ideas together. So some of the parallels I was thinking of would be like,
Hmm.
okay, like when we're consuming these things, we're labeling it as a particular culture, even though in our context, compared to the original context, it's completely different. One the thing that I was
Hmm.
thinking was Chinese food. Okay, so orange chicken, um, like a General Tso's chicken, right? Like a Panda Express, all of that. you're not really gonna find in China. I know. I was there. I checked. Um, and the funny thing is, like when we get Chinese takeout, right, it comes in that little white paper box, which is
Yes.
actually I think German in design. Funny enough, I think in some of your work you were describing that some of these things were dedicated to temples in things
Hmm.
like when a person was about to go on a voyage or came back from a voyage. So I was
Yes.
just thinking like a sort of analogous example would be like to go out, get an expensive Chinese takeout, take it to the temple, and like, here, God, thank you for allowing me to cross the sea safely. And I'm
I'm gonna say yes and no,
okay.
because the big difference is that these things are used in Egypt.
Ah.
So they are not just replicating something that is Egyptian in flavor, let's put it this way, or like that has the allure of being Egyptian, but they don't actually use it. These things are actually used in Egypt, which is fascinating, right?
Mhm.
But some things are not used in the same way. And some things that should be used in a certain way, like heart scarabs that are actually made for tombs, are not imported and not used, right?
Hmm.
It's very interesting. That's why during my defense I said I wish we could perform some necromancy and ask one of these people what they thought these things meant. But I know that my ex department frowned upon it. So I would not, but like, but it's really cool. So, but that's also why the whole like it's completely a knockoff doesn't really hold up, because these things are still used in their quote unquote country of origin, right? But some of the shapes are made for an international clientele, and some others are still used in Egypt, and some are made for for international audience, and then start being adopted in Egypt as well. It's a very complicated set of materials, and like, why did I do this and not the firefighter as I wanted as a child? I don't know. I wanted to be a firefighter, and now I'm an archaeologist. Oh.
Dr. Kate, I appreciate that you became an archaeologist. Okay.
Thank you.
Time for that hard-hitting question.
All
Okay.
right.
Okay. I tried so hard, but if this doesn't hit as hard as you were expecting, I'm sorry. Okay. So, we talked about finding all of these sort of Egyptian-inspired objects in the Sicilian
Mhm.
context. So, what Sicilian objects
Mm.
are in Egyptian tombs?
None.
None. None.
None.
Oh.
I would be so surprised. But also like Sicilian from where, right? Because are we talking about Sickle stuff? Are we talking Sicanian stuff? Are we talking Libyan stuff? Um, it goes one way. Um, yeah, yeah, it's very one way. Well, that we know of, right? I would love to find something Sicilian in Egypt. It would be my life's work, probably.
I
It would be fantastic.
I kind of wanted, maybe I'll do this for the thumbnail art for the podcast, but I wanted to do
Mhm.
like a Coppola hat. Is that the name of it? A Coppola hat? I don't know what it is. Is that cap
Yeah,
looking?
yeah, the cupola. Yeah,
Yeah, yeah,
yeah,
yeah. To find one of those in an Egyptian royalty tomb, to have one of the
yeah.
pharaohs wearing one of those. Oh,
Oh my god, it would be great. But I can tell you that from what a really good friend of mine who's living in Egypt right now is telling me, I can say without the shade of the doubt that the administration of Sicily and Egypt nowadays are very similar. So does that answer your question?
Uh, amazing. Well, well, thank you, Dr. Kate, for explaining all of that to us.
Thank you for allowing me to go bonkers on these things and talk about dog breeding and adopting and other things.
It was a wonderful conversation. So I'm going to invite you now to the
Mhm,
last segment of the show, um,
mhm.
plotting to kill the players.
Yes, let's kill players.
Okay.
I love this.
Okay. So let's go back to my idea. I guess.
Mhm,
Uh, since it's probably a good idea. Now that we're talking about,
mhm,
it, okay, what kind of object can we put in one city that so
mhm.
that the players learn to use it one way, and then when they come to the next city or second city or third city over, it changes. Like, what do you think of that?
Okay. So, well, I love the concept. It needs to be something that it can be used in weird ways, though, because like if it's a pot and like in one city it's used as a pot and the other city is used as a hat, that's too easy, right? That's almost too easy.
Yeah.
Um, I'm an evil person, right? Um, and I was thinking of like so two things came to mind, right? One was weapons, so like an actual like a weapon, like I don't know, a spear or something else. um that in one city is like the sign, like the status symbol for warriors, right? But in other cities, actually used to roll around like the wool when you're using the loom, right? That would be incredible. So actually, if you have that, instead of being like a powerful warrior, like, that's a weaver, that's fine. So weavers go around with like giant weapons on their belt because they're actually using it, like maybe just the spearhead, and they're actually using it because it's useful, right?
Right.
Something of the sort. That would be one thing, because I'm an evil person. Uh,
Now, I was just thinking, okay, so Greeks were very obsessed with smells. Okay, there is a particular episode of Articles of Interest, which comes from 99%
Mhm,
Invisible, where they talk about perfumes. And apparently,
mhm,
I didn't know this, but like in the 30s or 40s, there was a particular
mhm.
perfume that was very, very famous, very, very like alluring, considered very, very sexy, but it was made from like whale guts or like whale stomach.
Oh yes, ambergris.
Yeah.
Yes, 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 yes. Oh yeah, it's not just the guts. It's like from like this sort of like gallbladder stones that you get from whales. Yes, I've read Moby Dick. It's my favorite book. That's how I know these things.
Okay, so I'm just trying to think like, okay,
Ooh,
in one context, right, it might
mm,
be worn by, I don't know, like really sexy women, prostitutes, something
mhm,
like that. But in the next
mhm.
city, they're going to be like, this is trash or something like that. But I'm not sure how to kill the players with that.
Yeah, no, you can't. You can't really kill the players with perfume. But maybe. Oh, wait, wait, wait. No, I know how to kill the players with perfume. Because so here's how it can be done. It's not just, it's an ointment, right?
Okay.
So if you distill it, like, or like if you dilute it and like use it as a perfume, it's fine. But if you actually rub it on the skin, like in paste form or like gel or something like that, it's poisonous. Do you like that?
Oh, that might be a good one. Oh, okay, okay, okay. Now we have to sort of think of ways to trick them to use it like that. Okay.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. No, and that's a great thing, right? So maybe some people have like rings that open and there's a bit of it and you never know how they're gonna use it. Yes, Three Musketeers was also one of my favorite books when I was growing up. Thank you, Milady the Winter, for teaching me that yes, poison can be put in rings. But yeah, it could be an option. I'm not saying it should come from a panther, but it could come from a panther or a cougar.
What I'm thinking now is that maybe they run into a doctor that smells like the
Mm,
stuff. So they
mm.
always associate the idea of that smell with healing because it comes from a doctor.
Yes, but actually the doctor was smelling like the stuff because he had tried in vain to save someone who had been covered in that stuff.
Or, well, what I was thinking is that they have jars of the stuff, right? Because the thing is, though, as an
Mm,
apothecary, you probably have a bunch of poisons and things like that, so
well,
they probably
fair. Yes.
smell like it. And they're like, oh,
Oh, that's
I know
fair.
that smell. We should use that smell. And then they break open the bottle and they just smear it on the person, and then they immediately begin to like convulse, like, oh,
Oh, I love that. Fantastic.
oh my goodness. Okay.
Mm.
Thank you, Dr. Kate. Thank you, Dr. Kate.
You're most welcome.
All right. All right. And we'll end it there. Thank you, everybody, for listening, and welcome to Goblin Town. Yay.
Laying a trap and it goes off. Making up stuff for the extent of a whole campaign because players never do what you think they're going to do, then turning it all into a twist ending based on something read in the comment section and making sure to take all the credit when someone asks makes us smile. And we also do dinosaurs. Yes, we also do dinosaurs. Yes, we also do dinosaurs. Yes, we also do dinosaurs. Still hoping to find buried gold. Yes, we also do dinosaurs. Yes, we also do dinosaurs. Yes, we also do dinosaurs. Welcome to Goblin Town!